Hello, today I'll be discussing Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. This book is about Harriet Jacobs, or Linda Brent as portrayed in the book. So, in the beginning, the book discusses Harriet Jacobs' childhood and how she was born a slave, but she lived a few happy years of her life until she figured out that she was one. Eventually, her mom dies and she ends up living with her mistress, who takes great care of her. Her mistress teaches her how to read, write, sew, but eventually she does die and Harriet is sent off to the Flints. She slowly adjusts to the Flints, but as she got older, Mr. Flint tries to have a sexual relationship with her. And in order to avoid being in this abusive relationship, she ends up having two kids with Mr. Sands. And after this happened, Mr. Flint was planning to send Harriet's children away, but in order to stop this from happening, Harriet pretends that she escapes up north, but instead she actually hides in her grandmother's attic for a few years. And meanwhile, Harriet's children are sold to someone who pretended to be Mr. Sands. After living in her grandmother's attic for several years, she slowly becomes disabled because, she's living in such a tight space for a long time. But eventually she does reunite with her children where they end up living in Boston. And years later, Emily Flint, I think the daughter of Mr. Flint, captures Harriet and claims her as property due to the fugitive slave laws that were happening during this time. And she ends up going with Emily Flint, but then Mrs. Bruce ends up purchasing her and she's able to live freely. So some of the big events that are happening in this story during this time. Some of the big events that are happening in history during this time is the slave trade. It was expanding throughout the United States, and enslaved Africans were seen as property, and they had to serve their masters who bought and sold them. This impacted the author because she had to serve the Flints, and Mr. Flint especially was very abusive and controlling and treated her with inequality. The Civil War was another event that was happening during this time, but it didn't really affect Harriet that much because she was, busy taking care of her kids and trying to survive and get to freedom, as a woman. So it didn't really affect her as much. But the fugitive slave law also occurred, and this definitely affected Harriet because even though she escaped to the north, she was still, captured. And yes, so yeah, it definitely did affect her. Some of the challenges that the author had to face, the author's children were going to be separated from her, and she had to try to live in the attic and escape, and it was just a lot. But eventually she did get to reunite with them. And Harriet also had to face the challenge with the fugitive slave law because, as mentioned before, Emily Flint did try to take her back into slavery, even though she was up north. So what did their actions reveal about the author? This reveals that the author is very intelligent, she's caring, she cares a lot about her children, and she's very protective over them, and she's very resilient. She wants to fight for freedom, she wants to, do everything for her family so that they can all be united together and free. Some of the forms of resistance, as mentioned before, she moved up north and she resisted being abused by Mr. Flint by becoming a mistress of Mr. Sands, where she had her two children. The book ends because Linda, or Harriet Jacobs, is bought by Mrs. Bruce, and she's able to live freely, and she finally gets to reflect over what happened during her life. So one thing that caught my attention while reading was how she was able to resist being abused at such a young age. She thought of, instead of having to deal with Mr. Flint, she thought becoming pregnant with Mr. Sand was a better option. I thought that was just very, it caught my attention because, you know, she had to think of something. She had to form some type of resistance, you know. She didn't want to be abused by him. Another thing that caught my attention was how she lived in her grandmother's attic for such a long time. Her grandmother's attic was very small, and she lived in such a tight space for a long time, but she did what she had to do in order to fight for her children. And lastly, another thing that surprised me was how Emily Flint ended up finding Harriet Jacobs, even though she was up north, and wanted to buy her again because she claimed her as property due to the fugitive slave law. But, you know, Mrs. Bruce did take her back, so yeah. What did I learn about abolitionists? Abolitionists worked very hard in order to end slavery, and since it was such a very dark time in history, they wanted to put an end to this. What did I learn about society during this time? Majority of society, especially down south, was very evil in the sense that enslaved Africans were seen as property. They were seen as inferior. But the northern parts of the United States was a somewhat safer place for enslaved Africans or runaway slaves. But this fugitive slave law did affect slaves that went up north. Did this book reinforce your thoughts of the slaving system or make you see it differently? Yes, this book made me see slavery differently, especially through Harriet Jacobs' story because of the way she was treated, and I learned new things about what really happened to enslaved people, especially women, during this time. The impact of narratives on the anti-slavery movement. Narratives impacted the anti-slavery movement because they gave different perspectives on what people had to go through during a time of slavery, and it encouraged the anti-slavery movement. What was influencing the author? How did that impact the author? Family, fighting for, you know, Harriet Jacobs was fighting for her children, and to unite with them was influencing the author. And freedom, she wanted to gain freedom for them so that, you know, they could live a free life away from all of that. And some society and government interests that worked against the anti-slavery movement. Many people, especially whites down in the southern parts of the United States, were against the anti-slavery movement because they felt that African Americans were just, once again, inferior. They didn't matter as much as whites, and, you know, they were seen as like useless, you know, which is a very sad time. And a government interest is that a government interest against anti-slavery movement was kind of similar with the 3/5 compromise. The South wanted majority. They wanted to were against anti-slavery because they wanted to keep slaves, which would help give them more representation in the government. Okay, so that is everything for this video. Thank you for listening. Bye.